They never found the bodies. Not one. 47 brides gone before the wedding night was over. And yet, there are no graves, no death records, no mourning clothes worn by the men who called themselves their husbands. If you're already imagining some backwoods horror, let me stop you. This wasn't chaos. It was procedure. I'm about to tell you something that was never meant to leave the bloodlines of a single family, and by the time we're done, you'll understand why even the county's own historians swore to burn what they found. Picture Western Georgia, mid-1800s. Cotton was the empire, and the men who grew it ruled like kings. Among them, the Pritchards, 5 brothers, all rich, all unmarried, all claiming to be searching for the perfect wife. For 20 years they found them, and for 20 years those wives vanished. The Pritchards didn't take women from their neighbors' daughters. They went further. Savannah, Augusta, sometimes across state lines, always from families no one could afford to question. Father dead, mother sick, no brothers to protect them. And every story was the same. The girl was delicate, refined, needed privacy to adjust to her new life. Then, 3 days after arriving at the plantation, she was ill. Fever, weakness, no visitors allowed. Weeks passed, months. Then, the announcement. She's gone. Gone where? No one knew. No funeral, no grave in the family plot. And here's where it gets worse. Not once did the brothers follow the rules of Southern mourning. No black crepe on the door, no slow, grieving walk at Sunday service. The same week they buried their supposed grief, they were back in the market, looking for the next bride. Locals noticed. A few whispered. But if you think anyone confronted them, you don't understand the South in 1843. Money could make a man invisible. Fear could make a whole town forget. The Pritchards built their house like a trap. Sandstone walls 2 miles from the road, bridges over black water, and wings of the home that could be sealed shut from the rest. Some rooms had no windows at all, and in those rooms, well, that's where the trail of missing women ends. What I'm about to tell you will pull you into the same darkness those girls saw on their last night alive. But unlike them, you'll come out knowing exactly what happened and why the name Pritchard was erased from Georgia's history. The records say the first was Sarah Peyton, 19, no dowry, no father, and a mother who could barely stand. Jeremiah Pritchard, the eldest, found her in Augusta working as a seamstress for rich families who only knew her by the speed of her needle. He told the town she was a rare find, humble, virtuous, and blessed with the kind of loyalty money couldn't buy. He brought her to the plantation under the cover of dusk. No guests, no public vows, no community blessing, which, in that era, was almost unheard of. But Jeremiah had an excuse for everything. He said she was too shy, too delicate for the noise and bustle of strangers, that she needed time to settle into her role as a Pritchard before anyone could meet her. For 3 nights, lanterns moved back and forth between the main house and a small building near the river. Neighbors assumed it was wedding preparations. But one woman, Eleanor Fairchild, watched closely from her ridge. What she saw was not celebration, no music, no laughter, only shadows pacing, voices in urgent whispers, and once, a sound that did not belong to any animal. On the morning of the 4th day, a wagon rolled away from the plantation before sunrise. The wheels groaned under a heavy load. Jeremiah said nothing of it. Weeks passed. Sarah was ill, he claimed. First a fever, then weakness, then some mysterious condition that prevented her from seeing anyone. Not even the town's only doctor. 3 months later, she was gone. No burial, no headstone, no mourning clothes. You need to understand something. In the South at that time, death wasn't private. Funerals were a spectacle, a public confirmation that the family had honored the dead. To refuse that was to break the social code. And the Pritchards broke it without shame. A year later, Obadiah, the second brother, returned from Savannah with another bride, Charlotte Hicks. Same story, same secrecy, same illness, same vanishing. By now, a few in Carterville had begun to whisper, but they whispered carefully, because if you accused a man like a Pritchard without proof, you could lose your land, or your life. And here's the part most don't know. The disappearances weren't random. They were timed. Each marriage took place in a specific season, always at a point in the cotton cycle when the plantation's labor was at its lightest, as if the brothers needed time and privacy for something else. The question is, what could require such precision? The answer lay buried in a trunk no one was supposed to open. It was 1987 when the trunk surfaced. A carpenter named Ellison Price was clearing the remains of an old outbuilding near the Etowah River, a structure half swallowed by vines and rot, when his crowbar hit something hollow beneath the floorboards. Inside was a cedar chest, the kind you'd expect to find filled with quilts or family Bibles, but the brass lock was engraved with a name long absent from the county's records: Pritchard. The chest smelled of old paper and iron. Price, not knowing the weight of what he'd found, pried it open. The first thing he saw wasn't clothing, but ledgers, dozens of them. Neat columns of dates, names, places. Every name was a woman's. Every entry ended with the same final mark, a small black cross. There were also letters, not love letters but correspondence between the brothers, discussing acquisitions in coded terms, referring to brides as subjects, and worse, instructions for preparations that matched exactly the time gaps between each wedding and each disappearance. One sheet, folded into quarters and stained with something brown, read simply, "Ensure complete separation of the subject from all external stimuli. No light, no sound. Do not permit the subject to sleep until the transition is complete." Price brought the trunk to the Bartow County Historical Society. Within a week, 3 separate archivists had refused to catalogue it. One resigned on the spot, and then, without explanation, the chest vanished from the Society's inventory, officially lost to water damage. But Price swore he saw it being loaded into an unmarked van 2 nights later. Only fragments of its contents survive today, passed quietly between collectors who know better than to display them. Those fragments tell us something chilling. The Pritchards weren't killing for lust or revenge, they were converting, transforming. Every note spoke of the night of unbinding, an event always coinciding with the 3rd night after a bride's arrival, the exact night Eleanor Fairchild saw the wagon leave, the same night those lanterns moved between the main house and that riverside building. What did they mean by unbinding? And why did they need women from far-off towns, women whose absence would cause no uproar? Because the Pritchards weren't just erasing these women from life. They were erasing them from identity itself. And what replaces a human identity can be used. You can learn more about a family from the way they build than from anything they say, and the Pritchards built for control. Their plantation was a labyrinth, not a home. The main house sat like a fortress 2 miles off the road, shielded by 3 narrow bridges over dark tributaries. No visitor ever accidentally arrived at the Pritchards. You had to be invited or escorted. Each wing could be sealed off entirely, with iron-banded oak doors that locked from the outside. Below the sandstone walls ran basements, some lined in brick, others carved directly into the bedrock. Those lower rooms had no windows, no natural light, just air that tasted of rust and stone. The most unusual structure was down by the Etowah River, the building Eleanor Fairchild had seen on those wedding nights. From the outside, it looked like a smokehouse or grain store, but its floor plan, drawn in a surviving ledger, revealed a single narrow chamber at the center, wrapped in thick stone walls. The only door was heavy enough to withstand a battering ram. Inside, there were hooks bolted into the ceiling beams, not for meat, but for lanterns, so light could be lowered or raised without the person inside ever seeing who held it. The ledgers called this place the transition room. Here's where the psychology of the Pritchards becomes clear. They weren't killing quickly. They were breaking their brides, stripping away every familiar sensation until the mind no longer recognized itself. Darkness for hours, then sudden bursts of light. Periods of silence broken by sharp, unfamiliar sounds. Sleep deprivation. Isolation so complete that the victim would cling to anything offered, even the hand of the man responsible. Modern psychologists call this identity destabilization. The Pritchards didn't have the term, but they had the method, and they executed it with the precision of a harvest sea. Chepto. On the third night, after hours in that sealed chamber, the bride would be brought back to the house. According to one recovered note, she was to speak no name but her husband's, to eat only from his hand, and to follow without resistance. That is not love, that is programming. And once a mind is programmed, it can be directed. It can be used to carry messages no one else will hear, to perform acts no one else will suspect. The Pritchard brides didn't just vanish, they were sent somewhere, and when they returned, they were no longer themselves. The first sign that the brides had been returned was always the same. A pale figure seen walking at dawn along the tree line, hair tangled, eyes vacant. But those who saw them swore that the woman they recognized was altered, not just exhausted, not just ill, altered in the way a tool is altered after it's been sharpened, the same object, but dangerous now. The Pritchards would announce that the bride had taken ill and would require seclusion for her health. That seclusion lasted weeks. During that time, no family member, no friend, no church elder was allowed to visit. Letters sent to the women were never acknowledged. In rare cases, the husband himself would dictate a short reply, stiff, formal, stripped of personal detail, and sign her name at the bottom. When the women finally reappeared in public, they wore different clothing. Gone were the floral cottons and soft colors. Instead, dark wool, high collars, gloves, even in summer. They spoke little, smiled even less. Their movements were precise, almost rehearsed, and each now carried something new. A small wooden case, just large enough to hold a few folded pages, a sealed vial, or a slip of cloth. These cases were never opened in public, but witnesses said they were passed, hand to hand, to strangers in train stations, to traveling salesmen, to riverboat crewmen bound north, always discreet, always without hesitation. This is where the surviving fragments of testimony grow unsettling. One Pritchard neighbor, an elderly farmhand named Silas Warren, claimed he saw a returned bride meet with a man in a grey suit at the Rome, Georgia station. She handed him the case, then leaned close and whispered into his ear for nearly a full minute. The man did not reply, only nodded, tipped his hat, and boarded the next train without buying a ticket. No one knows what instructions were being carried, or to whom, but there is a pattern in the records. Days after these handoffs, events would unfold far from the plantation: a fire in a courthouse in Alabama, the disappearance of a ledger in South Carolina, the sudden death of a political rival in Atlanta. Whatever the Pritchards were doing with these women, it reached beyond Etowah County. Their brides had become couriers, and not by choice. And then, in the winter of 1884, something happened that changed everything. A bride did not return. Her name was Eliza May Cooper, 19 years old, recently wed to Samuel Pritchard, the youngest of the brothers. By all accounts, she was quick-witted, stubborn, and fiercely protective of her younger sister, who still lived on her father's farm. When Samuel married her, neighbors whispered that the match wouldn't last long. But they underestimated how the Pritchards dealt with inconvenience. Eliza was sent away under the same vague pretext as the others, a visit to relatives in Savannah that no one could verify. Weeks passed. The usual curtain of silence fell over her whereabouts. But unlike the other brides, Eliza did not return to the plantation. No early morning figure on the tree line. No slow procession back into Pritchard life. The official word was that she had taken ill and died unexpectedly. The body, they said, was already buried on distant family land. No viewing, no grave for visitors, no proof. It would have ended there, had it not been for one strange piece of evidence, a sealed envelope, postmarked from Augusta, bearing Eliza's handwriting. It arrived at her sister's home a month after the Pritchards announced her death. Inside was a single sheet of paper, with only 8 words written in a sharp, hurried script. "They want me to carry something I won't." That letter was quickly confiscated by a man claiming to be a representative of the Pritchard estate, but her sister had already memorized it. And though no one could prove it, the timing of the letter lined up with a curious incident in Augusta. A federal marshal found dead in a boarding house, his satchel missing, his pockets turned out. The Pritchards doubled their security in those weeks, hired armed men, stopped shipments coming into the plantation, sent word through local lawmen that trespassing on their land would be met with gunfire. The brothers held midnight meetings in the east wing of the big house, their voices carrying through the cold air like low thunder. But there was something else too, a tension not seen before. The Pritchards had always been confident, almost smug, in how they operated. Eliza's disappearance was different. She hadn't just defied them, she'd escaped with knowledge of whatever the wooden cases contained. And the truth is, for the first time, the Pritchards seemed afraid. In the months following Eliza's vanishing, whispers began moving through river towns and dusty crossroads. Men who made their living on the water claimed they'd ferried a girl in widow's black, who paid in gold coins older than the Republic. A telegraph clerk in Charleston swore he'd sent coded messages for a young woman matching her description. Messages that used no names, only dates and coordinates. Each of those coordinates, when traced, led to remote areas near railway sidings or abandoned Confederate supply depots. Whatever she was doing, Eliza wasn't running blind. She was moving with purpose. She was retracing a path that others had taken before her, a path the Pritchards clearly wanted erased. One man, a retired Pinkerton agent named Jasper Hallow, would later admit to tracking her for a private client. He said she was carrying a leather-bound ledger wrapped in oilcloth that she never let out of her sight. Hallow followed her as far as Wilmington, where he lost her trail after a fire consumed the boarding house she was staying in. The cause was officially listed as accidental, but the witnesses spoke of men in fine coats seen slipping away through the alleys minutes before the blaze began. Meanwhile, back on the plantation, the brothers made a series of calculated moves. They stopped using the front dock on the Savannah River entirely. They shifted all freight deliveries to a hidden landing upriver, reachable only by a half-mile stretch of swamp road, and for the first time in years, the wooden cases themselves disappeared from sight. Whatever was in them was either moved or hidden so well that even their own field hands never saw one again. But a slip in their careful control occurred, one that would fuel rumors for decades. A plantation stable hand, an old freedman named Isaiah Bell, claimed to have seen Samuel Pritchard himself unloading one of Timburn's cases at the new landing. Isaiah said the case was half broken from the journey, its lid warped, and through the gap he glimpsed something that shone like glass, but moved like water. Weeks later, Isaiah vanished. His shack was found ransacked, the floorboards pried up as if someone had been searching for something. No body was ever recovered. Eliza's trail had gone cold, but the Pritchards' fear had not faded. If anything, it had deepened, because if she still carried that ledger, she still held the power to bring their entire empire crashing down. By the summer of 1866, the ledger's legend had already grown into something larger than Eliza herself. Those who had supposedly laid eyes on it claimed it wasn't a mere accounting book. It was a map, a list, and a confession all in one. Written in a cramped, deliberate hand, it detailed shipments going back decades, each marked not just with dates and destinations, but with strange symbols in the margins, a cross over an open circle, an inverted triangle filled with red ink, and, most unsettling of all, a recurring series of tally marks that never matched the numbers in the shipment logs. Some believed the ledger was proof the Pritchards had trafficked in more than cotton and tobacco. A few even whispered it contained the locations of burial grounds that didn't appear on any map, places where the missing were laid to rest in silence, their deaths hidden under layers of commerce and polite society. The tally marks, they said, were not goods. They were people. That theory gained weight when a letter surfaced in Savannah, postmarked from Wilmington, addressed to a former Union intelligence officer named Henry Stowe. The letter, written in a woman's hand, spoke cryptically of unmasking the devils who live in daylight, and warned Stowe to keep his pistol loaded. Enclosed with the letter was a single page torn from a ledger, bearing the same symbols later attributed to the Pritchard's book. Stowe never made it to Wilmington. His body was found outside Augusta, throat cut, pockets turned out. The page from the ledger was gone. It was around this time that reports of the riders began. Black horses, their coats slick as oil, galloping through the back roads at night with 2 or 3 men in long coats hunched low in the saddle. They were said to appear wherever the ledger's trail resurfaced, always too late to catch Eliza, but never too late to erase her helpers. Witnesses swore the riders carried no lanterns, yet seemed to navigate the dark like men who'd ridden the same paths for years. The ledger's nature became more than a rumor. It became a weapon. Whoever held it could expose the hidden architecture of the Pritchards' wealth, their crimes, and the network of men in cities up and down the eastern seaboard who kept their hands clean while their pockets grew heavy. And if Eliza still held that ledger, she wasn't just a fugitive anymore. She was a walking death sentence, not just for herself, but for anyone who dared help her. The first confirmed sighting came not from a lawman or a bounty hunter, but from a riverboat captain named Miles Cray, a man who swore he'd seen just about every kind of trouble the Mississippi could throw at a soul. In late September 1866, his vessel, the River Swan, was moored along a fog-choked bend outside Natchez when a lone woman boarded under cover of darkness. She paid in silver coins so worn their faces were almost gone, and she never gave her name. But Cray noticed two things he'd never forget: the raw, chapped skin around her wrists, like she'd once worn irons for too long, and a leather satchel she kept clutched so tightly that her knuckles went white. She stayed only until dawn. Before the fog lifted, she was gone, slipping into the cypress swamps that stretched for miles. The crew joked about ghosts in the night, but Cray didn't laugh. That satchel, he later swore, was just large enough to hold a book. The day after she vanished into the swamp, the riders came. Not 3 of them this time, 6. They didn't knock. They walked straight aboard the River Swan, their boots dripping mud onto the deck. They asked no questions about cargo or passengers. They went straight to Cray's cabin, tore open his drawers, and burned half his logbooks on the spot. When Cray demanded to know what they were looking for, the tallest of them simply said, "Something she took that belongs to better men than you." Then they left as suddenly as they came, but not before nailing something to the River Swan's mainmast. A scrap of oilcloth, smeared with mud, bearing a single symbol painted in what looked like rust, but smelled unmistakably of blood. The cross over an open circle. Word of the riders' visit spread through the docks like sickness. Every man who heard the story seemed to draw the same conclusion. Eliza was alive, and she still had the ledger. But the message nailed. To the mast wasn't meant for the crew, it was meant for her. If she was anywhere near Natchez, she'd know the riders were closing in, and they weren't just after her. That's when the killings began. Not in public, not in daylight, but in quiet corners of towns where people thought themselves safe. A dockhand found, drowned in a barrel of molasses. A midwife's throat slit while she bent over her supper. None of them had spoken to Eliza, but all of them had kin who once worked for the Pritchards, and in the ledger's pages, that was enough. By the time October's chill crept down the river, Eliza had learned 2 things the hard way. She could not outrun the riders forever, and she could trust almost no one. Almost. The man who found her was no hero, at least not in the storybooks. His name was Jonah Pike, a former Confederate scout turned smuggler who'd been left with a limp, a scar that split his lip, and an appetite for trouble. He found her half-starved in the back room of a shuttered smokehouse outside Port Gibson, crouched over the ledger as if the very act of closing it would draw a bullet. He didn't ask why she had it. He simply asked what she was willing to pay to keep breathing. Eliza didn't have money. What she had was worse: information. She opened the ledger to a page halfway through and slid it toward him. In cramped, neat handwriting were names Jonah recognized: plantation owners, river traders, county judges, alongside numbers so large they made his stomach knot. But it wasn't the money that held him. It was the notations beside certain names, written in a darker ink. Widow knows, child still missing, paid in silence. Jonah realized then why the riders hunted her with such unholy persistence. The ledger wasn't just a record of debts, it was a map of sins, a list of people the Pritchards owned, not with chains, but with shame. And in those pages Jonah saw his own chance at leverage. And revenge. The Pritchards had burned half the South to feed their empire, and he'd been one of their pawns. If this book was real, it could bring them down, or at least hurt them in ways bullets never could. Still, he knew the cost. Anyone who touched that ledger seemed to end up in the ground, and he wasn't ready for that yet. So Jonah made her a deal. He'd get her out of Mississippi and into the backcountry trails of Arkansas, where the riders' horses would falter and their informants would lead the scent. In return, she'd keep the ledger hidden, from him, from everyone, until the day they had the means to use it. Eliza agreed. She didn't tell him the truth, that she had no intention of hiding it forever, because in her mind, the ledger wasn't a weapon to be kept. It was a confession to be read aloud to the world, and she was already deciding whose name would be the first to burn. They left Port Gibson under the veil of rain, not the kind that merely dampened a man's coat, but the relentless, soaking downpour that turned roads to rivers and swallowed hoofprints before they could be followed. Jonah knew it was the only gift the sky would give them, a few hours in which the riders' hounds would lose the scent. The route he chose wasn't on any map. It twisted through flooded cane fields, abandoned sawmills, and stretches of blackwater swamp, where the cypress roots jutted from the earth like skeletal hands. Here, the world felt ancient and watchful. Every sound, the groan of a half-rotted pier, the low bellow of an unseen bullfrog, seemed to come from a place older than the Pritchard's greed. Eliza clutched the ledger to her chest beneath her coat. Jonah had told her to hide it in the saddlebag, but she refused. She'd already seen what happened to things left too far from her grasp. They disappeared. She would rather drown in the swamp clutching that book than wake to find it gone. By the third night, they had reached the edge of the Arkansas backcountry, a land of jagged ridges and narrow passes where even the bravest horsemen slowed their pace. But their pursuers had adapted. The rain had stopped. The air was clearer, colder, and in the stillness of dawn, Jonah spotted movement on the ridge above. A lone rider, sitting unnervingly still, watching them. This was no ordinary scout. He rode a black mare with white eyes, and the rifle across his back wasn't the crude hunting iron most riders carried. Jonah recognized it instantly. A Whitworth, the kind used by Confederate sharpshooters. The man's posture told him everything. This was a hunter who had no intention of running them down. He would wait, study, and take his shot when it mattered most. That night they made camp in a ravine, hoping the high stone walls would shield them from siege. But Jonah couldn't shake the feeling that the man on the ridge was still out there, somewhere in the darkness, glassing them through his rifle scope. Eliza noticed his unease. "You've seen him before," she said quietly. Jonah didn't answer right away. He was staring into the fire, remembering a siege in '64, a single shot that had taken a captain's head clean off from half a mile away. "Yeah," he said finally, his voice low. "And if he's here, it means the Pritchards aren't just chasing us anymore. They've decided we don't get to be taken alive." By dawn, Jonah's decision was made. The ridge was suicide. If they stayed on the open pass, the Whitworth would speak before midday, and one of them wouldn't see nightfall. He led Eliza down a deer path, so narrow the horse's flanks brushed the rock walls on either side. The air here was damp and close, the smell of earth so heavy it felt like breathing through wet cloth. This was outlaw country now. Not the storybook kind, but the real thing. Hollowed-out mining towns abandoned after the veins ran dry, where the only people left were men who couldn't show their faces in any lawful place. Jonah had known a few of them in another life. They were dangerous in ways the Pritchards' hired guns could never be, because here the only law was hunger. As the sun burned through the morning haze, they came upon a ruin of a settlement. The church was half collapsed, the bell missing, its rope frayed and dangling like a noose. A single cabin still stood with smoke curling from the chimney. Jonah stopped the horses. "Keep your hand near that pistol," he murmured. The door of the cabin opened slowly. A man stepped out, lean and tall, with a face like dried leather and a shotgun cradled in his arms. His eyes flicked from Jonah to Eliza, then to the bulge beneath her coat where the ledger was hidden. "Ain't much for sale here," he said, voice flat, "and I don't take kindly to strangers cutting through my land." Jonah kept his voice steady. "Just passing through, looking to trade for supplies, maybe a little news." The man studied them for a long moment, then nodded toward the ridge they'd avoided. "You've got a shadow. Black horse, white-eyed. He's been keeping to high ground all morning." Eliza's grip on the reins tightened. "Can you help us lose him?" she asked. The man gave a thin smile. "Lose him? No, but I can make him choose another target." He glanced at Jonah. "For a prey, BAME." Jonah knew that tone, the same one used in saloons before a knife came out. Whatever the price was, it wouldn't be in coin alone. But before he could answer, a sound cracked through the stillness. Not the boom of a shotgun, but the sharp, distant report of a Whitworth. Something hissed past Jonah's ear and struck the cabin wall, splintering the wood. The man with the shotgun didn't flinch. "Too late to bargain," he said quietly. "He's found his mark." The first shot was only a warning. Jonah knew that because if the Whitworth had truly been aimed to kill, his skull would have been a red mist by now. This was a hunter playing with his prey, cutting off escape routes, forcing them into a corner where he could finish the game clean. "Back inside," the shotgun man said, his voice as calm as if he were discussing the weather. Eliza hesitated, looking to Jonah, but he gave a curt nod. They ducked into the cabin, the air thick with the smell of old wood smoke and something metallic beneath it. Blood, long dried into the floorboards. The man moved to a slit in the wall where sunlight bled through. He tilted his head, listening. 2 minutes, he said softly. That's how long before he moves to a better angle. Jonah checked his revolver. 6 shots, but only 4 he trusted not to misfire. Eliza's breathing was sharp and fast, her hand tight on the ledger hidden beneath her coat. She whispered, "We can't stay here." "No," Jonah agreed, "but we can make him think we are." The shotgun man gave a thin smile and reached under the table, pulling out something wrapped in oilskin. He unrolled it, revealing a rifle older than Jonah, its stock carved with dozens of notches. "This old girl ain't got the reach of a Whitworth, but she's tasted enough blood to make a man careful." Outside, the ridge was silent except for the faint cry of a hawk. Jonah knew the sniper was watching for movement, any flicker in a window, any shadow that stretched the wrong way. He gestured to Eliza, and she slipped into the far corner out of sight. Then Jonah took off his coat, bunched it into a rough human shape, and propped it against the window slit. He counted under his breath. 1, 2, 3. The rifle cracked again. The coat's shoulder erupted in a puff of dust and fabric. At that same moment, the shotgun man leaned out the back, firing ahead. Into the trees where the echo had come from, the blast rolled through the valley like thunder. For a heartbeat, the sniper didn't return fire. Jonah used that heartbeat to grab Eliza's arm. "Out the back, now!" They burst through the rear door into the narrow gulch behind the cabin. The air smelled of wet rock and pine sap. Somewhere above, a crow gave a harsh call. Not a bird's warning, but the sound of a man signaling. "He's not alone," Jonah said, and then the ground in front of them exploded in a spray of dirt and stone. The second shot didn't come from the ridge. It came from somewhere closer, somewhere low. Jonah yanked Eliza down just as another round split the bark of the pine beside her head. "2 of them," Jonah growled. "1 to herd, 1 to kill." The gulch was narrow, walls of jagged shale closing in on both sides, funneling them forward into a kill box. Above, the pale sky seemed impossibly far away. The shotgun man was behind them now, covering the rear, his boots crunching on loose stone. "You keep running when I tell you," Jonah whispered to Eliza. "Don't stop for me." "I'm not leaving you," she shot back. Her voice trembled, but her eyes were set. She wasn't going to argue, she was going to follow. Jonah almost cursed. Loyalty was a beautiful thing right up until it got people killed. A flicker of movement caught his eye. A shadow sliding along the rock face to their right. The second man. He was close enough for Jonah to see the faint glint of his pistol barrel, the twitch of his shoulder as he adjusted his aim. Jonah didn't hesitate. He dropped to one knee and fired twice. The first shot rang out sharp and clean. The second misfired with a dull click. The man jerked back behind the rock, but Jonah knew he'd winged him. Blood would slow him, but it wouldn't stop him. "Move!" Jonah barked. Eliza sprinted forward, boots slipping on gravel. The gulch bent sharply left, and Jonah caught sight of something ahead, an old rope bridge spanning a gap in the rock. It swayed in the wind like a snake, its boards darkened with rot. The shotgun man caught up, breathing hard. That bridge won't hold us all, he warned. It doesn't have to, Jonah replied. His eyes were fixed on the supports, frayed hemp ropes, weather-bleached and ready to give. We cross, we cut it. Behind them, the first sniper's shot cracked, the bullet smashing into stone just above Jonah's head. A piece of shale stung his face. They were being driven toward the bridge exactly as planned. Jonah grinned, not with joy, but with the grim satisfaction of a man who knows the only way out is through blood. Let's give them what they want, he said, and take the ground out from under them while we're at it. The three of them dashed for the bridge, the air alive with gunfire. Somewhere behind, boots pounded against the rock. The hunters were closing in. The first step onto the rope bridge was like stepping onto the spine of a dying animal. Every board groaned, every rope shuddered as if begging to be cut loose. The gap beneath was no ordinary fall. It was a sheer plunge into a black maw of stone and rushing water, the roar of the river below echoing like the throat of some patient predator. Jonah went first, forcing the boards to take his weight, testing them before letting Eliza follow. The shotgun man brought up the rear, swiveling every few seconds to send a round back at their pursuers. The bridge swayed violently, each shot causing the ropes to vibrate like the strings of some great, discordant instrument. "Keep your eyes on the far side," Jonah called over the wind. "Don't look down." Eliza's breath came in sharp bursts, her boots slipping on a warped plank. Jonah reached back, gripping her wrist before she could pitch sideways. Her eyes were wide, but not from the height. She was staring past him, toward the opposite cliff. Jonah turned. At first he saw only rock and shadow. Then the shadow shifted. A figure stepped into the light, tall, lean, and wrapped in a long oilskin coat. The man's hat was pulled low, but Jonah didn't need to see his face. The stance was enough. Calm, patient, utterly certain of his aim. In his hands, a long rifle rested against his shoulder, the barrel already leveled at Jonah's chest. "They've got both ends," Eliza whispered. The realization hit Jonah like a second drop into the gorge. This wasn't an ambush in the gulch. This was a cage, built long before they stepped foot here. The hunters hadn't been chasing them toward escape. They'd been driving them into the line of this rifle all along. Behind, the sniper on the ridge fired again, the shot splintering a plank just inches from Jonah's boot. The bridge lurched. The shotgun man cursed, returning fire toward the ridge. But his shots went wild. The sway made aiming hopeless. Jonah's mind raced. Cutting the bridge would send them all into the river. Crossing meant walking into a bullet. Staying meant dying where they stood. He took one last step forward, feeling the entire structure groan beneath him. "We make our own way," he said under his breath. Then he drew the knife from his belt and slashed downward, not at the ropes, but at the plank beneath his feet. The sound of snapping wood was lost in the howl of the wind. The plank gave way beneath Jonah's boots, and for a heartbeat the world became weightless chaos. Eliza screamed, her hands snatching at the ropes, the shotgun man bellowing curses that dissolved into the wind. Jonah's legs swung into empty space, the river's roar now deafening, a sound that seemed less like water and more like some ancient voice, hungry and patient. He didn't fall, not yet. His left arm locked around the fraying bridge rope, tendons screaming, fingers burning from the friction. Below, the water churned white, but Jonah could see black shapes rolling just under the surface, too large, too deliberate to be debris. The river wasn't just water, it moved like something alive. "Climb up!" Eliza shouted, her voice cracking. But her eyes weren't on Jonah. They were on the far side of the bridge, where the rifleman had shifted his aim. He wasn't firing yet. He was watching, measuring, waiting for Jonah to move. Behind them, the hunters closed in, the snap of their rifles punctuating every sway of the bridge. The shotgun man managed another blast, dropping one pursuer, but it only bought them seconds. A bullet ripped through the rope beside Jonah's head, the fibers uncoiling like a snake's body. Jonah knew it. The rope would give any second. If he climbed back up, he'd be an easy mark. If he dropped, the river would swallow him whole. The only advantage left was surprise. "Don't follow me," he told Eliza, voice low but firm. "Whatever you see, keep moving." And then, without giving her the chance to argue, Jonah let go. The plunge was a single brutal instant. Cold water slammed into him like a wall, the current dragging him down into blind darkness. The noise of the battle above faded into a muffled, distant world. But the river's pull was not random. It was deliberate, tugging him along a channel that twisted beneath the gorge. He fought for air, but when he surfaced again, it was not beneath open sky. He was inside a cavern, lit only by a faint green glow that seemed to pulse from the walls. The water here was calm, but the air carried a heavy scent, metallic, old, like the inside of a tomb. On the far shore of the cavern, a shadow stood waiting, and it spoke his name. Jonah froze in the waist-deep water, his breath loud in his ears. The cavern amplified every drop, every ripple, until it sounded like an entire ocean shifting around him. Jonah. The voice came again, low and deliberate, as if savoring each syllable. It wasn't the ragged shout of a hunter, nor the trembling fear of an ally. It was calm, certain, like someone calling home a dog they owned. He strained to see, but the green glow warped distance, bending the figure's outline until it seemed to waver like heat over desert sand. Whoever, or whatever but it was, it stood impossibly still, no shifting weight, no breath. Just watching. Jonah's instincts screamed at him to dive back under, to let the river carry him further. But something heavier than fear rooted him to the spot. Curiosity, yes, but more than that. Recognition. He couldn't place it, but the cadence of the voice had the taste of memory. "How? Do you know my name?" Jonah asked, his voice bouncing back in hollow echoes. "Because," the shadow said, stepping forward into the glow, "I knew it before you were born." The light caught part of the figure's face, an angular jaw, eyes the color of polished iron, and skin pale enough to look carved from stone. The clothes were not from the present. They clung to him like the remnants of a military uniform decades out of date, its brass buttons tarnished black. Jonah stumbled a step closer without realizing, his boots scraping the rocky bottom. You were on the bridge?" A faint smile ghosted across the man's lips. "No, I was under it. I've been under all of it, waiting." The cavern seemed to tighten around them, the glow from the walls dimming as if in response to the man's words. Jonah's pulse thudded in his throat. Behind him the water whispered against the stone, carrying faint, distorted echoes of gunfire far above. The hunters were still out there. Boo. But right now they felt like the lesser danger. The man took another step forward, water lapping at his knees. "You don't know what you've been carrying, Jonah, but I do. And if you leave this place without hearing me out, it will kill you." Jonah didn't answer, because in that moment he realized something far more disturbing. He had seen this man before, in a photograph. And the photograph was dated 1872. Jonah's mind raced, clawing through fragments of memory. The photograph, he could see it clearly now. Sepia tones. 4 men standing in front of a collapsed mineshaft, their faces hard and unblinking. And there, in the far right corner, the same pale face, the same iron-colored eyes, exactly as he appeared now, no older, no younger, frozen in time. That picture had been buried in a folder his father kept locked in an old roll-top desk. Jonah had only seen it once, years ago, when he was 8 and snooping where he shouldn't have been. His father had caught him, snatched the photo away, and with a sharpness Jonah had never heard before, told him never to ask about it. A week later, the desk was gone. Now, standing knee-deep in the cold black water, Jonah felt the same chill in his bones. Only this time, it wasn't from his father's voice. "You're not supposed to be here," Jonah managed, the words cracking halfway out of his mouth. The man's expression didn't change. "Neither are you, but the river decides who it shows itself to. It decided on you a long time ago." Somewhere in the distance, muffled but growing sharper, came the barking orders of the hunters. Jonah turned his head toward the sound, instinctively tensing, but when he looked back, the man had closed the distance between them without a ripple in the water. "You think they're after you because you stumbled onto their land?" the man said, voice low. "No, they're after you because of what's inside you, something you inherited without knowing, and if they catch you, they'll carve it out." Jonah took a step back, but the rock wall pressed against his spine. "I don't even know what you're talking about." The man tilted his head. "You will. But first, you have to survive the next 10 minutes, and for that—" He reached into his coat, producing something small, metallic, and slick with moisture. "We're going to need this." Jonah's eyes narrowed as the object caught the sickly green light. It wasn't a weapon. Not exactly. It looked more like a key, but its teeth were jagged, uneven, and blackened at the tips as if they had been burned. "Take it," the man said. "When the water rises, you'll know where to use it." Jonah hesitated, his pulse hammering, because deep down he already knew something about that key. He had seen it before, in the same photograph. The hunters' voices were closer now, no longer muffled by stone, but sharp, echoing, bouncing off the slick cavern walls. Jonah could hear the snap of boots on wet rock, the clink of metal buckles, and the metallic rasp of rifles being readied. The man didn't flinch. He simply pressed the strange blackened key into Jonah's hand, his fingers cold as river stones. "Don't drop it, don't show it, and whatever you do, don't turn it in the wrong direction." "What happens if I—" Jonah began. But the man was gone. Not stepping away, not ducking into shadow. Gone. One moment he stood there, half his coat floating in the black water. The next the space was empty, as if he had never been there at all. Jonah's breath quickened. His first impulse was to wade deeper, to find another exit, but the cavern walls were jagged and unforgiving. His second impulse, the one that truly terrified him, was to look into the water. He did. Something was moving beneath the surface. Not a fish, not a current, a shape, long, angular, drifting closer. The green light glinted along it, and for a fraction of a second, Jonah thought he saw fingers. The bark of a man's voice cut the thought in half. "He's in here!" Jonah spun. A beam of light slashed across the cavern, blinding him. The hunters poured in through a jagged break in the wall, 4 of them, their eyes wild, their coats dripping from the rain outside. They fanned out quickly, practiced, each step sending echoes skittering across the stone. The lead hunter, a gaunt man with a scar cutting from his ear to his collarbone, raised his rifle but didn't fire. He just smiled. "You've got something that doesn't belong to you, boy." Jonah's hand tightened instinctively around the key in his pocket. He didn't need to see their faces to know. They knew about it. "Give it here," the scarred man said, stepping forward. "And maybe you get to leave breathing." Jonah's eyes darted to the water. The shape beneath the surface had vanished. The river was waiting. And in that moment, Jonah understood the man's warning. When the water rises, he'd have to choose whether to use the key or drown with it. The water was no longer lapping gently at Jonah's boots. It was surging, curling around his knees with a force that seemed unnatural, pulling at him, urging him toward the black center of the cavern. The hunters noticed it too, their eyes flicking nervously towards the widening current. "What's happening?" one of them muttered, his voice cracked. The scarred man ignored the question, stepping closer to Jonah. "Hand it over." Jonah's heartbeat thudded in his ears. The key felt heavier now, almost pulsing against his palm, as though it were alive. In the green light, its edges seemed sharper, its shape shifting in ways he couldn't quite name. He thought about the stranger's warning, "Don't turn it in the wrong direction." But what was the right one? A rush of cold swept through the chamber. The hunters swore under their breath as the water climbed their legs. In the far darkness, something stirred. Not a fish, not a man, something older. The ripples were too slow for the speed of the current, too deliberate. The scarred man lunged. Jonah reacted without thinking, pulling the key from his pocket. The hunters froze. None of them moved to grab it. They only stared. "You have no idea what you're holding," the scarred man said. His voice had lost its confidence. "If you turn it wrong." A sound like a deep, resonant click filled the chamber. Jonah didn't remember deciding, but his fingers had already twisted the key. The green light flared, so bright it burned his eyes. The water exploded upward, a towering column that split into dozens of writhing shapes. They had arms, long and bone-thin, ending in hands that clawed the air. The hunters screamed as the shapes reached for them, dragging them into the black depths. Jonah stumbled back against the rock wall, gasping. The column turned toward him. The water didn't grab him. It bowed. The shapes sank back into the river, leaving only the silent, swirling current. When the light dimmed, Jonah was alone. The key was gone from his hand. His palm was wet, but not from the water. A thin line of blood traced across it, as though something had marked him. From the darkness beyond the cavern came a voice, the stranger's voice, impossibly far and impossibly close. You turned it the right way. This time,